the recording and turn on the captions. All right. Here we go.
Good evening, friends. My name is Bridget Moix. I'm General Secretary at FCNL, and I have the joy of welcoming you this evening to our February Quaker Changemaker event on just migration, seeing beyond the border. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We have a wonderful gathering of friends assembling, lots of familiar faces and names and some new ones too. So thank you all so much for taking time to be here for this important conversation. And yes, please feel free to welcome one another and greet each other in the chat box if you'd like. This is a conversation that is ongoing, and I'm very excited to take this next step in the conversation after having the honor of traveling to the border with Anika Forrest earlier, well, last year, I guess, in the fall, and really beginning to look at the situation of migration in the border, how it relates to our own communities and migrants in the United States across this country, and our national policies. And so this conversation will be a continuation of thinking together about solutions for a more just migration system and how we can all be part of that. I want to especially thank our speakers for this evening. Anika Forrest is our Legislative Director of Domestic Policy and recently served as Legislative Manager for Migration Policy, an expert and a very deeply dedicated migration advocate. And Jennifer Long has served as the Director of Casa Marianella for over 20 years. And Casa Marianella is a shelter and community center for displaced immigrants that are in Austin, Texas. So really grateful to have you joining us, Jennifer, all the way from across the country. Before we start the conversation, I want to ask my colleague Claire Carter to share some of our logistics for the evening.
Hello, everyone. My name is Claire Carter, and I'm FCNL's Quaker Engagement Program Assistant. I'll be running technology for this event, so here are a few tech considerations before we get started. Be sure to say hello in the chat, share your name, location, and meeting or church if you have one. This is a way to build community virtually, and it's really fun to see who's here in the chat. We're so glad you're here. As you can see, we are recording this event, but the audience will not be included in the recording for privacy reasons, just the speakers. Even so, feel free to turn off your video if you are uncomfortable keeping it on. Captioning is available automatically. If you do not want to see the captions, you can click on the live transcript option on your Zoom toolbar and click Hide Subtitles. We'll have some time for you to ask questions towards the end of the event, and we will do our best to address as many questions as we have time for, but we'll likely not get to all of them. Please submit your questions in the chat, and Bridget will direct them to the panelists. Please contact me if you are in need of Zoom tech support. You can private chat me from Zoom's chat bar or email me at ccarter@fcnl.org. Back to you, Bridget.
Thanks so much, Claire. So as we're gathering, there's still some folks joining us, which is wonderful. And we wanted to just start with a moment of gathering together in silence and thinking together about the conversation ahead. So if we can just take a moment, friends. Thanks, everyone. It's always helpful to have that pause and breath after a long, full day. So again, a reminder that you can always share your thoughts and questions in the chat as we go, and we'll try to address as many as we can. It's always a robust conversation. So let's dive in to our time together, and we're going to have some questions together with Anika and Jennifer and myself, and then after a little bit, we'll get into questions with the audience as well. And I just want to start by asking Anika and Jennifer if they could just ground us a little bit in the current situation in terms of what's happening with migrants and with policy issues, and what are the most important things for us to be focused on right now?
Yeah, I can kick us off, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. I think part of the conversation when we think about migration justice in the US is really that it's perceived as this sort of crisis and this tension. And it's really hard to unpack all of it and filter through the noise. And so often, particularly when you think about the US border and sort of the reception and transition for new arrivals, a lot of the problems that we see are really symptoms of a greater and larger issue, and that's the US government's failure. I would call it willful failure because we have the authority and the means to do something about it, and we don't, to establish some sort of efficient community-based solution and answer that's sustainable for migration management, that recognizes that when we think about our asylum seekers and when we think about our migrants, these aren't irregular patterns. Movement is normal. There are ebbs and flows, yes, but they're also perceivable and understandable when we think about root causes of migration and so forth. So it's really a conversation that becomes fuller and more accurate when we allow the perspective of those who are having the lived experience, for those who are in the work, to then lead the conversation on the federal side. We have a little bit of the reverse right now, which creates this DC complex and sort of political chess play game about a border crisis or whatever it may be, when really we have a migration crisis and a management crisis and a humanitarian crisis, and one that is self-constructed and in many ways a falsified tension. Because when we think about productive measures, be it humane reception, be it protection for undocumented community members, that is one conversation. When we think about border management, that is another. And the harm is that they're currently being conflated.
That's really helpful. And I remember being at the border with you, Anika, and hearing the different perspectives from people who are really living the realities of this and see it up close. Could you just say a little bit more about some of the challenges and the processes that we're seeing in the current migration system, specifically, and how people deal with that at the source.
Right. There are three things I think I'd want to highlight. Root causes, our asylum system and process in general, and then limited pathways. So when we think about root causes, it's clear that there's a lot of forced migration happening, and how the US addresses it and pinpoints it and reconciles it in its migration laws is lagging and falling behind. But the indicators are so clear. So if we think about, for example, Haitian migrants, there have been many in high volumes over the last couple of years. And if we look at recent history in Haiti, be it political instability, be it environmental disasters, be it conflict. If we look at it in a longer time frame, looking at militarism and imperialism practices often imposed by the US in intervention in both policy and in practice, it's not surprising that forced migration would stem from that. And yet we don't have ways that account for it and that respond to it. And that happens repeatedly from many of the countries that we see having high volume of nationals coming to the US. During our border visit, it really stuck out to me when we spoke with one Border Patrol agent who's been in this work in terms of border enforcement for 20 years. So he started right after the Department of Homeland Security was created. And he talked about the frustration he has that our government doesn't look at root causes more, so that migration can be voluntary and that it can be more orderly and that people aren't taking these very dangerous pathways to be able to find some refuge and to find stability. The other piece is our asylum process. It is almost like an Olympics to get protections that should just be possible and feasible for folks. It's such a narrow legal standard to be able to get asylum in the US. And many don't realize that, be it folks who talk about the practice all the time and what's lawful or unlawful, or the people who are trying to seek protections. There's this notion of having a credible fear of persecution that people have to meet, a very high evidentiary threshold. There are only certain types of backgrounds that qualify for asylum, things like race and ethnicity, national origin, political opinion. Things like gender and sexual orientation are not their own grounds. They fall within this construction called a particular social group, which is a headache. The courts sometimes still don't know what it means. And so you have people who are coming because they're coming from oppression, or they're dealing with instability, they're dealing with fear, and they just want a way to have some peace and to have a life where they can thrive, but they don't meet that standard in those thresholds, let alone all the other restrictions that we have then also applied onto our asylum process. And then the third is stemming out of that limited pathway. So if people don't meet the grounds for asylum, what else exists? And the reality is that there aren't a lot of them. The Biden administration created something recently, sort of a humanitarian parole program that we can unpack more a little bit through this call, which is a good indicator, but it's also a 2-year temporary protection, right? So when we're thinking about people who are fleeing tragedy and disaster, hard pressed to think that in 2 years they can return to their place of origin.
Yeah, thank you. I remember just being overwhelmed and baffled when we watched some of the court proceedings for cases and wondering how could anyone, much less, I couldn't even follow that. And I think I know a little bit about this country and how it works, and just really feeling the pain of the complexity of the system that we have and the difficulty of people to navigate it. I want to turn to Jennifer now and ask you, because you're working with migrants, people who are living this day in and day out. What are you seeing from your perspective, and what do you think we should be focusing on?
No, we have a program for asylum, and that's a good thing. And truthfully, the problem is not just a US problem, it is a global problem. And one of the big problems is that we have people traveling all over the world all the time in desperate situations, and there is no global strategy for how to receive them. In the United States, we are serving asylum seekers who come from all over the world, who are perfectly legally in the United States. They're granted the ability to apply for asylum, and yet the asylum program ends right there. we do not provide shelter, we do not provide food, we do not provide legal services, we do not provide a work permit, things that would be provided in countries we compare ourselves to, like Europe and Canada. And so we've really set people up for this sink or swim situation where they have to figure out how to survive in this country, and then how to fulfill all their obligations to ICE, and how to go to court and represent themselves in what Anika just explained is a very complex process. So to me, it's a very broken program, and it's so based, our immigration is so based on our security rather than on compassion. How do we think about our responsibility to the world and doing our part? We can't do everything, but we can do our part, and we can do it better. But I would like to say one good news thing. We had a guy at Casa Marinella today who won asylum on WebEx from Eritrea. So today he won asylum. So it does happen.
That's wonderful. It's good to have those good news stories to keep us going, for sure. Well, I hear what you're saying about the complexities of people and just the needs not being met by the system that we have in any way. At FCNL, some people on the call will know we have now been hosting and welcoming migrants at Friend's Place, which is a new guest house that we're managing. And we've had, as of today, 615 migrants pass through. And this was never anything we planned. It arose because the busing that started happening from the border to Washington, D.C. presented a very clear and present need in our own community, and we had a way that we could try to respond. So I'm grateful that we were able to do that, but it really makes me think about, how does the reality and the lived situation of people link to the policy work that we're doing, and how can that help strengthen all of our work together? So I wanted to ask you, Anika, how do you see FCNL's work being influenced as we partner to offer migrant support and work with more groups around the border areas as well? And then Jennifer, maybe if you could think with us about what are opportunities to work together more with community centers like yours in Texas and lobbyists like ours in DC.
Yeah, I'll probably use a few anecdotes to sort of demonstrate the answer to that question. So Bridget, when you and I went on the border visit, we heard a lot from folks about the need for funding so people can actually provide care, provide transportation that's not theatrical or akin to human trafficking at times, but really about getting people to the places that they need to be and to the receiving communities that they have here in the US. And I remember when we were in El Paso, we met with a county official who talked about the welcome center that the county had provided for folks who are in the US and have some provisions, and they have family members or friends or whatever it may be in Chicago or somewhere else, and they need someone to act as a conduit, so to speak, to help them get there and connect the pieces and get tickets booked and things like that, find somewhere they can have a little bit of a reprieve after being released from Border Patrol. And we heard in that conversation that people are really worried about the funding that the federal government has provided under FEMA in a temporary basis to provide some of those and sustain some of those practices and responses. And then a couple of days after that, I went to Austin and I was talking with Jennifer, and she was referring to a lot of the work that is happening within shelter networks and so forth. And I heard the same thing, that FEMA money is really important and people are worried that it's going to be cut off. And so for me, that was a very telling moment where we can sort of be in our DC space and think we know what is most eminent and what is most important, or we can listen to the folks who are doing the work. And so while we've always talked about caring for welcome, when we came back, we did get more engaged and involved in the conversations about how can we see the final spending and funding bill from the US government include funding for migrant support and services. And so we celebrated that it was included, and not just sort of as the emergency funding that it had typically been as, but now as a shelter and service program specifically for migrants. 800 million passed, pretty unprecedented. And so we are hoping to see that continue and deepening our sort of experience in that conversation. And then I think another piece is you talked about Friends Place, and the director of Friends Place, Sarah Johnson, and I have been on a few lobby visits together. Because even though we're right here in DC, where a lot of folks are being bused and almost right on the steps of the Capitol building, not everyone's very in tune with that conversation and what's happening. And so I'm talking to our legislators and to their staff about the experience of asylum seekers and migrants. And there have been conversations that we've also been able to elevate about work permits, for example, how folks who are seeking asylum do not have that authorization right away. And so we have really prevented people's very ability to sustain themselves and to provide stability and safety while they are waiting for the adjudication and finalization on their immigration cases. So having that perspective has been really useful in terms of making sure that our work is informed. We have to make sure that we're doing this in a way that holds accountable to the people whose lives are most impacted.
So at Casa Marianella last year, we resettled 545 people. And the thing that's unusual about our shelter is that we serve the people who don't have any family or friend connections in the United States. And there are lots of those people. And there is a huge lack of other places that we can send people. There's a tiny handful of us who are doing this work around the country. So I'm very excited about this $800 million. I wonder if that's going to help develop more shelters in the interior, because we have very few partners currently. One of the things I'm excited about is this group called Cities for Action. There are 180 city leaders that are joined together in affirming a desire for a more just immigration policy. And I would love to see a shelter like Casa Marianella in all 180 of those cities. Our own new mayor just joined, so I'm happy to see that Austin is now on the list of Cities for Action as well.
That's a great news and a great idea, and I hope we can make it happen somehow. So just thinking about what you just said about sort of, a more just a migration system, migration justice, we call our program. That can feel like a huge, massive endeavor. And often we feel like we're not making much progress on it, and we can feel overwhelmed. And I remember being at the border, just trying to understand how would we even begin to address this enormous problem, felt really daunting. And we talked about concerted efforts and the importance of ongoing communication between the practitioners, people working directly with migrants, the advocates, and policymakers themselves. But there's also this really important work that happens at the very local level, and that's so important to the conversation. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the community-based solutions that we're seeing to try to advance a just immigration system, and how we can be supportive of those.
Right. I think that it's so important for more people to be directly in contact with asylum seekers, providing them with homes, providing them with the social services they need. People come to us, they usually have tremendous medical needs that were often deficits that they had in their country and were made worse on their journey. They have legal needs. They often have psychological needs. Everyone is suffering from trauma. And there's such an important role for all of us to be neighborly to people coming into our country who are in such a desperate situation. And they tend to be kind of hidden, and we don't find them. But it would be wonderful if we had a real network of people all over the country that we could work back and forth and kind of quietly help this whole underground group of people who are arriving and are legally here and have a good chance of staying here if they only have the support that they need, which we have the capability to provide, because these are pretty straightforward things that people need, but it requires an army of people to be willing to do it.
Yeah, that's a theme we heard at the border from a number of groups, really saying we need this infrastructure, this community infrastructure in the US to provide welcome and support. And I know Some Quaker meetings and churches are already doing that, and I'm sure others would like to do more on it. So thank you. Anika, what about your perspective on that infrastructure and this, community-based approach?
Yeah, I think for me it's like there's that saying that all human rights is local. And so thinking about how we can really have coordinated efforts with all the varying stakeholders. It's something that I learned really deeply and intimately when I worked at the city level in Philadelphia, and we offered a lot of migrant support services, including creating a legal defense fund for immigrants who were experiencing and facing deportation and removal proceedings. And so thinking about what are the basic necessities, what are the support services that folks need, from shelter to legal aid to translation to whatever it may be, and ensuring that there's a roadmap and a system for folks being able to access that and to tap into those systems, and that it isn't just limited to one spot or one location, but you can almost have some sort of mapping going on. I remember when we were on the Mexico side of the border and at a lot of migrant shelters, and folks were talking about, in some ways, like, yes, people are just waiting to hear when they can get across the border. And then we were always asking, like, but what happens after that? Are there folks that we know that they're going to be connected to? And often the answer was no, right? Like, they're just thinking about what is the next step, but there isn't a receiving community or receiving system for them. And if we really want to have migration management, we can't just think about that in a top-down federal way, but we also need to think about how local communities can be a part of it, in our border communities, but also, like Jennifer said, within the interior.
It's interesting because people who come to the border, they assume, oh, I'm coming to the richest country in the history of the world. I'm sure they're going to have great services available to me. And it's such a shock to them to find out nothing. I mean, in Mexico, there are shelters all over the country. Even when people first arrive in Brazil from Africa, they receive social services from the government. And then to arrive in the United States and receive nothing, I think they're not expecting that. And they're baffled if they don't have family or friends to go to. Where can I go to get the help I need? Which has resulted in all these people being in homeless shelters in New York City and Washington, D.C. and Boston, which is not the right setting.
Yeah, it's shocking really to think that we provide so little when we know the need is so great, and are the country that welcomes the masses supposedly. So a lot of work to do there. I just want to ask one more question, and then I know we're starting to get some questions in the chat box, which is great, and we had some folks send some in earlier, so we'll turn to audience questions in just a minute. But I wanted to ask on a more kind of practical level, how can we, Quakers, other advocates and allies and migration justice seekers around the country, some of whom, are not close to the border, or not directly engaged with Congress right now, how can we make an impact? What are the practical kind of things that we can be doing from our communities and with our policymakers as we look at the situation now? Anika, do you want to kick us off on that?
Yeah, probably unsurprisingly, advocacy is what I'm going to think of and sort of defer to first. And that has many different iterations, and doesn't mean that folks have to be based in DC. That local pressure, that local voice is so important, because change doesn't happen from the halls of power, so to speak. They happen locally first. And so where we have so many folks who are involved in migrant support services, like, those voices need to be heard and need to be amplified, and legislators should be hearing from them. I hear from folks all the time, from Georgia to Iowa to New Mexico, you name it, who are doing this work. And it's important for policymakers to be involved in it too, because it speaks to that proximity. When folks have more proximity, we can switch the narrative on this conversation a lot more, and get to the solutions that need to occur. It really is cruel and inhumane that when folks are seeking refuge, the first thing they experience in the US is militarized enforcement and more trauma. And there's a lot we can do to unpack that. So from a more technical point of view, there are things that FCNL is looking at. We have things called case management programs for asylum seekers, which means after they are released from Border Patrol processing, as opposed to being held indefinitely in ICE detention while they wait for the acronym for Immigration and Customs Enforcement detention before they have their immigration proceeding, folks can be released and be connected with community-based providers and so forth. A system that we know works and ensures the dignity of every individual. We talked a little bit about that migrant shelter and servicing program. That should not be a one-off occurrence. How can we ensure that this upcoming spending bill has, again, at least 100 or 800 million in it to ensure that we are building long-term facilities and care, and that NGOs who are in part of this conversation are getting the funding they need. But that does not happen unless Congress and policymakers know it's the will of the people.
So we have capacity for about 150 people a night, and we currently have about 200. We are constantly in search of people or groups who are willing to take someone in. I would welcome anyone who wants to contact me about sponsoring an asylum seeker or a family. It's a huge, huge need, and we could really use the support. I was just wanting to say one thing about the surprise people have when they come to our border. We have a man from Somalia right now named Mahad, who was so shocked by the way he was received at the border at night that he said he waited till the morning to look and make sure the American flag was on the person's arm because he couldn't believe this was the United States. So at any rate, not great. It's certainly right on the border where people are put in those cold cells and treated really very cruelly in their very first days in the US.
Yes, that is not the welcome we want. And I know that some people will want to follow up with you, I imagine. So I think Claire's going to make sure that we share your contact information in the chat box, and that people can track that, and we'll send it out afterwards as well. So hope we get some offers of support.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah. So let's turn to questions from the audience. We have about half of our time left still, which is great for discussion with the audience. And we've got a number of questions coming in. I want to start, we received with a number of questions in advance of the event. And some of what you just said now makes me want to ask this kind of big picture question about Congress. Since we are at the start of a new Congress and FCNL focuses on so much work with Congress, and what is really going to be possible with Congress now, with this Congress? What can actually be achieved? There's also been some legislative work on things like DACA, Dreamers legislation in the past, Title 42. Anika's done a huge amount of work on. So would love to hear, Anika, you answer some of those questions about what can we possibly do with Congress and where some of these things stand. And then Jennifer, I know we talked a little bit about what's possible without Congress, because we can't just wait for Congress. And so maybe you could talk about what are the possibilities of what can be achieved even without Congress.
Yeah, I can kick it off from the congressional front. The reality is, outside of our appropriations and funding legislation, Congress has not passed something substantial in immigration in years, in some cases, decades. And so a lot of what our work looks like is how we are building up that support and getting more allies and getting more champions so that we can get a lot of the equitable and humane measures that are overdue passed. You mentioned Dreamers legislation for our undocumented folks who are children when they come into the country, most of whom aren't children anymore. Many of them are in their 20s and 30s with their own families. And for nearly 2 decades now, Senator Durbin has been introducing the DREAM Act. It was reintroduced again earlier this month with Senator Graham co-sponsoring it. So it is great that we have folks from both sides of the aisle who are supporting that legislation. And Senator Graham has moved up in his ranking on the judiciary. So now we have the chairman and the ranking chairman of the overseeing committee in support of that legislation. So that is a good sign. We also see some of the challenges before it. In the very same press release for the DREAM Act, Senator Graham talked about how he doesn't see this moving without us doing something about the border and border security first. So that is really the challenge we find, sort of I alluded to at the top of this call about how we can unpack and divide and divorce these conversations that really don't have one bearing on each other. The other piece is, because like I said, appropriations is moving. When we talk about a lot of the services that are needed and support systems, that is a great opening that we have right now to ensure that the basic response that folks require when they get here is something that becomes a norm for us. We can't say that we are offering protection or that we are honoring the right to asylum and then not have life-sustaining measures go along with it. That is an incomplete system. That is a falsity. And so making sure that that is seen as a normal part of our process, there's a good opening there for us to be able to make that more of a norm. And then the last piece, Bridget, because you mentioned Title 42, and for those who may be unfamiliar, Title 42 is a measure that was created during the Trump administration in response to the pandemic, saying in times of public health emergency, the US can regulate who can enter, and it has served as a complete bar on asylum. And there's been a lot of litigation on it to give the most current space in where we are. The Supreme Court was supposed to have hearings at the beginning of March in response to a federal court decision late last year terminating Title 42. That hearing has been canceled because the Biden administration announced that it's going to end the public health emergency on May 11th, and Title 42 is tied to the public health emergency. And so if that actually ends, Title 42 and that asylum ban would essentially finish. And so the courts decided that they're going to wait and see what happens there before they actually review and make a decision on whether Title 42 is a legal measure or not.
I've seen a number of beneficial things that have come out with the Biden administration, sort of in the same way that the Trump administration did the opposite, putting more and more barriers in front of all different kinds of immigrants. I like the visa program that's for Ukrainians, Haitians, Venezuelans, Nicaraguans, and Cubans, which opens the door just a crack for the first time to people to come in legally on an airplane with a visa and have a work permit immediately. I like the lifting of the Muslim ban. It's so cool that we have Somalians again staying at Casa Marinella. We hadn't seen them for like 5 years. I'm seeing more people winning asylum. And I think that's just the atmosphere of the administration, that maybe judges are not under as much pressure to deny all the cases as they were in the previous administration. And then when they had this data breach in which a bunch of people's private information was released accidentally when they were in detention, we've gotten a number of those people who have been released in response to that, even though one of the guys told me he was set to be deported. He was released instead and given another shot at his asylum claim because he was part of that data breach. And so these are all things that happen just out of having a different kind of administration with a different orientation. There's a possibility for some real good to happen.
That is encouraging and good to hear direct positive impact of change. You brought up work visas, and we actually got a specific question. So I wanted to ask this question about Representative Pingree's bill to provide work permits to asylees, and what's the prospect for that this session? Is it going to be introduced quickly again this year? And the person noted that there are people ready to work and employers, at least in Maine, ready to hire them. So what do we know more about that, Anika?
Yeah, I can't speak to that specific bill right now in terms of the trajectory for its reintroduction. There have been a lot of conversations in Congress around work permits and protections for asylum seekers. There have also been talks about whether it's a conversation that the administration should maybe be taking up more, to have a more immediate and ready response as opposed to going through what can be a lengthy process through Congress. But I do know it's on the hearts and minds of many legislators across the aisle.
Great, thank you.
I'm part of a group of people from around the country who do the work that I do, and we met with someone from Homeland Security and said, you know, forget giving people housing and food and legal services. How about just let them work, you know, so they can actually pay for those things themselves. And we were told that was a non-starter, that there was no way they were going to give work permits. So it would be fantastic if they did. I mean, that's obviously the most just solution. There's a need for workers and people want to work. It's the most healing thing people can do is have a job and be able to support themselves and take care of their families. So that would be wonderful.
Absolutely, absolutely. I wanted to look at another question that might be for you, Jennifer, at least to start, which is someone from, looks like Colorado, a friend from Colorado asked, how do we connect better with the border organizations and tap into this stream of work? And especially if, in this case, the city of Denver for this person, is holding all the planning and funding close to their chest. So, are there ways that local groups and communities in other parts of the country can connect even when the city and the governments aren't helping that happen?
Totally, because there are networks of border shelters. There are networks of those of us who are working more in the interior, and we would be delighted to have more contacts in more places. And so it does not need to go through any official channels. This is a citizen effort generally. And so happy when all the mayors are working on things, but there's plenty of people that would be happy to communicate with anyone anywhere in the country.
Great, thank you. And Nika, do you have any thoughts on how local groups can engage, either nationally or locally with their governments to better coordinate and work together?
Yeah, I guess there's a few ways to think about it. I think I almost hesitate saying this, but there is a role where local officials play in it, right? And so where you can have conversations with those folks and allow them to also be sort of delegation representatives and what happens on the federal level, that's a powerful tool to utilize and think about. And then I can't readily speak to some, but there are a lot of local networks that folks could tap into. So if people have questions about those, you can reach out. And if I know of one in your area, I'm happy to share that information.
Thanks. And I saw that one of the question askers already put in the chat that they're going to reach out to you, Jennifer, and be in touch. So I'm glad we're helping make some of those connections tonight. There are a few questions that people have sent in that go back to the root cause question and sort of the damage that U.S. foreign policy does to economies and to democracy and safety in other places. And I wonder if you can talk at all about that intersection of issues and how do we address that?
Yeah, a lot of it has to do with the sort of response programs we have put in place, or even the intowment practices. We've seen the Biden administration begin to work on some of that, particularly in Central America, be it dealing with more employment opportunities and local entrepreneurship and so forth. Sometimes it's dealing with local conflict and violence. When we think about peace building, for example, and a lot of root causes related to war and to instability, having those underlined. But the reality is, unless the US really creates foreign policies that think in a long strategic way, when you have one administration that gives funding for 2 or 3 years, and then another administration comes and cuts it off, and then another one comes and does it for another 4 years, you've created more instability and sort of more imperialism through your aid, as opposed to creating solutions. And so longer term intentional solutions that aren't just based on US interpretations of what needs to happen in countries, but really allows local society and civil society to be at the forefront of that and to work in a regional perspective is how we begin to unpack a lot of those harms and to reposition the conversations and the ways that we've created instability.
It would be wonderful if our foreign aid were designed along the lines of uplifting countries instead of along the lines of supporting US corporations. And unfortunately, that hasn't been done. But specifically, I see it every day in relation to Central America and Mexico, where so much of the instability was created by our policies. And I mean, the whole fact that we exported gang culture back to Central America during the wars there and blanketed those countries with weapons. And now those countries are so unstable and gang filled that it's hard for people to live there. And yet those are the very people that we're the cruelest to. They're the main people that are being left in Mexico under Title 42, or the Latinos. And we're not giving them asylum either, because we say, oh, well, you weren't persecuted by the government. That's a criminal problem. So yeah, there's a huge deficit in terms of our debt to people of Latin America, and they are very much suffering under our immigration policy.
Yes, thank you. A lot of work to do on the root causes that our own policies are part of. I wanted to capture a few questions that have come in that relate to one another. And it goes back to something that you both referred to in terms of border security, and this idea that, many people are driven by fear and are fomenting fear of immigrants and of the idea that people coming across the border are criminals or worse, or somehow threatening the safety and security of our communities. And I wonder how you deal with those perspectives and arguments that people make, either Anika talking to congressional offices when you get this perspective, or Jennifer, in the day-to-day work of working with communities, how to deal with that sense of fear-driven perspectives rather than really the understanding of the human side of the problem.
Yeah, from a congressional perspective, sometimes it really is that act of listening. I can sit and visit sometimes and it's really frustrating. But then when I try to hear what they're saying, then it allows me to be able to speak to it more and to figure out how we can challenge it and how we can figure out where the real disconnect is. And it varies. Sometimes folks are worried about fentanyl. Sometimes folks are worried about human trafficking. Sometimes people, frankly, it's just rooted in hate and in racism, right? And so you approach all those things very differently. A lot of the pieces, though, that speak to the idea of criminality and so forth, part of it is just dealing with the facts and the reality. So when we look at the fentanyl conversation, for example, a lot of that is apprehended through our ports of entry, right? And most of it is not from migrants. A lot of it's from US citizens. And so thinking about the existing infrastructures that we have in the US and how that conversation needs to be looked at from a conversation of sort of drug regulation and enforcement as opposed to migration enforcement, thinking about what our ports of entries actually are and how they are or aren't connected to migration has been a starter with some offices, even offices that you maybe would not think would be open to that conversation. The other piece of it is really realizing that the more we push deterrence and the more that we push enforcement to prevent our perceived harms, we actually elevate the issues. So for example, the Biden administration just released an asylum ban law, frankly, that says for folks who are coming to the US to seek asylum, if you didn't look for asylum or seek it in one of the countries that you traveled through before getting here, there's going to be this rebuttable presumption that you were ineligible for asylum. And one of their reasonings behind that is that they feel that creating this process will prevent human smuggling and a lot of human trafficking involved in migration. The exact opposite is true in reality. The more that you create barriers, the more that people are going to end up seeking harmful means to be able to get here, the more that they're going to be able be pushed into a corner to seek paths that are less safe. And it creates an underscoring of our asylum law. Like, people talk about what's unlawful. Our asylum law, our US immigration law, says present yourself on US soil and ask for protection. That is our law. And yet when people come here and do that, we're told that in the hundreds of thousands, we have an illegal immigration problem that's then conflated with other issues.
Yeah, I think one of the ways I address this with people that I deal with through Casa Marinella is to try to get people to look at the global situation, because I think in America, we suffer from some myths, like the fact that we think that everyone is coming to the United States and everyone's coming here for money or something like that, And I think it's very important to look at the fact that we have 60 million people around the world who are searching for a safe place to go right now. And that number is going up all the time, will continue to go up with climate change, that we are one small part in a global problem and a global migration pattern that has gone on from time immemorial. And our task as Americans is to do our part and do as much as we can, which is more than what we're doing. We have the capacity to do more. We don't have the capacity to do everything, but we have the capacity to do it more humanely, and we have the capacity to do more of it. And I think if you look at it that way, it's not as scary. Because I think looking at it from a security only point of view is this like we're embattled. We're the only ones in the world that are having all these people coming here and bothering us. And that's not true. There are asylum seekers in every country in the world, and we're just one of them.
That's really helpful and a very important reminder. So one more question I saw in the chat box earlier, and that it relates to another question, just to, kind of about the legality question and the blurring of people when they come in, because the system's confusing. Someone asked, if people are here legally, why are they underground? So that was one question. You can think about how you would respond to that. And another one is about, what is our policy towards who can legally come? And Anika just explained some of the asylum welcome is policy. But what are the limits? Should there be limits? How do we as migration justice advocates think about those kind of questions?
Let me answer that one first, Anika, because I'm the one who said underground. I wasn't referring to their legal status. I meant the fact that it's an invisible thing that's happening in our country. The fact that we have all these people detained, that we're deporting people every day, that people are struggling every day to survive all over the country is like an invisible thing. I don't mean underground in a legal sense. So I did not mean to say that. All right, back to you, Anika.
So a lot of it depends on which populations and demographics we're thinking about. So we have our asylum seekers, for example. And part of that process is, and I don't want to get too technical with folks, but at some point you can have sort of like an affirmative assumption where you're here and you're waiting for the adjudication of your case, but you don't have an official status yet. And there's a massive backlog in the US. So some people are waiting up to 4 or 5 years before they ever get their asylum case decided on. And so for some folks who are in that process, you have to wait months before you can ever get your work permit. And depending on if you're on the affirmative or defense, it's possible that it may not happen. If you're a migrant, it's even more steep. The legal pathways in the US that are most common are either through employment-based or through family-based. Family-based is narrow, it's immediate family. It's more about the immediate nexus. So your grandmother, sure, you can get in a derivative way. Your aunt who may have raised you, that is not a way for you to be able to get status. And so I think that's part of the process that people don't always understand or appreciate, that there isn't this overabundance. And even within those systems, there are hundreds of thousands of those visas, employment-based and family-based, that have not been used over the last few decades. We have percentage caps for different countries in terms of how many people can enter. So if you're from a nation like Estonia, that doesn't mean much. If you're somewhere from like India or China or Mexico, where there are higher populations trying to get into the US, you could be waiting decades before you gain entry. And so there are a lot of different factors in terms of why people aren't always able to get the status that they deserve. And then of course, we have our undocumented population. There are 11 million people in this country, from our dreamers to farm workers to essential workers, who don't have a pathway to citizenship. Our laws have not created that. And so we have left people in indefinite limbo.
One of the funny things to me was, not funny at all, but a lot of the people who were sent on buses to Washington and New York were from Venezuela, and Venezuela's economy has collapsed and it's a very difficult place to live. And we were, for some reason, letting thousands and thousands of Venezuelans in earlier this year. And when our governor, Abbott, first started sending busloads of people, it wasn't reported even in NPR that these people were undocumented, which was ridiculous, because if that was the case, he was committing a felony. You can't send people on buses to Washington or New York if they're undocumented. All of those people had papers. They all had a right to seek asylum, and yet they were treated like what? Invaders.
Yeah, and we saw many of their paperwork was even sometimes taken at the border or just confused. And so even if they're not trying to live underground, we have huge numbers of people having to live in the shadows of our country because their needs aren't met or they're not recognized as having rights. So thank you so much. So many important issues that you've helped us cover. We're coming close to the end of our time. So I just want to wrap it up with kind of a final question to leave with the audience, which is really about where do you see some signs of hope, or what is it that keeps you moving in this work despite all those challenges?
For me, it's always, I guess it's threefold. One, I do this work from a very personal place. Being the child of immigrants, a lot of these conversations are ones that are not foreign to me. I grew up in them. And so being able to be a part of the change-making process is a very cathartic experience, as opposed to it just being feeling like we are on the defense, or feeling like we are being treated as subjects as opposed to actual people and communities. It's also a faith conversation for me. I grew up in the Christian tradition, and so for me, I feel like I am doing God's work. Right, this is my sort of mission, so to speak, and I get encouragement through that. I get sort of fortified through that, knowing to me that this work is that of goodness and righteousness, which means that I know in the end we're going to prevail. And then the last bit is the work that I do in community, like in seeing how people stick at this, knowing that maybe everything which we seek might not happen in our lifetime, but we are helping to build the blocks because we are undoing centuries of oppression. So it's not something that can be done overnight, but there are always signs of progress. Jennifer spoke to a lot of them that have happened just in this administration. Something like the Remain in Mexico policy that was around for so long. The Biden administration was able to get that thrown out through the courts. And so while we still have a lot of barriers and challenges, we do also still have a lot of progress.
And I think, the wonderful thing about the United States is that we're an immigrant nation. And even though we're in denial of the fact that we're an immigrant nation, but I think that's a lot of what makes us such a wonderful country. And the people that I meet that come through our doors from all over the world are the most patriotic people you could ever meet. They're so grateful for the opportunity. And we do have wonderful things in this country. I mean, we have women's rights. So many of the people who come to us haven't had rights. We have freedom of speech. We have economic opportunity, and we have social mobility. We see people doing extremely well after they come to this country in the way that immigrants traditionally have. And that's so energizing. And also the generosity of people that do participate. I'm in the presence of generosity all the time. So it just, it's very inspiring, and it's a little confusing to me why there are not more people doing the kind of work we're doing of hospitality, because I get such huge benefits from it. So yeah, I find it very inspiring.
Thank you, Jennifer and Anika. I find this conversation very inspiring, and I'm so grateful for all the work that you all are doing, that so many other people are doing in communities, and for the hope that you've given us this evening to keep up this work. We have just a couple minutes, and I know Claire has some wrap-up announcements for us and reminders on next steps.
Sorry about that. My audio was being a little wonky. Thank you, Bridget. Before we conclude our event for this evening, I want to share a few things with you all. If you are inspired by tonight's discussion and want to take further action, I'm going to paste an action alert in the chat to tell Congress to invest in humane migration solutions. And I'm also going to be pasting in the chat a registration link for our Spring Lobby Weekend registration, as we will not be hosting a Quaker Changemaker event in March due to Spring Lobby Weekend. So if you have young adults in your life, or if you are a young adult and want to come to DC to learn about advocacy and lobby in support of violence interruption programs, I encourage you to check out this link that I'm about to send in the chat. Thank you so much for coming to our February Quaker Changemaker event, everyone. I hope you have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you, friends. Good night.